When you live out in the countryside, you get the pleasure of hearing all sorts of wild tales. Many of them you can just chalk up to folks being bored and having crazy imaginations. Overblown hunting stories, all sorts of critters and animals spotted on the hillside. If you live anywhere out in the country or outside the city, you probably have your own experiences or memories of being told stories. Some of them sound like the person retelling of their own stories of the old, and have probably sunk a little too much moonshine over the years. And then, there are those which sound so damn unbelievable and stupid, you know they have to be fake. That is, until the day you witness it for yourself. That's what happened to me. I had lived and worked on our farm all my life. My great-grandparents built it from nothing, from the ground up, with their two hands. It was the pride and joy of the family. Not too far from our furthest field was a larger river, and even though this was farm country, this particular river in parts was more swampy, really deep and boggy, and we made damn sure to keep fencing up so none of the livestock ended up falling and drowning. Of course, this also made that particular area of water something of a local Area 51 for the crazies to come up with their conspiracy theories. You see, they had reported all sorts of weird noises and sounds, and especially lights at night. But I had never seen or heard any of that myself, even though many of them claimed that there were weird things going on. One of them claimed there was a weird magnetic sensation around that river. But again, I never experienced that, nor would my family ever admit to such things. One in particular, though, made very little sense. It was the usual power company that pumps chemicals into water, causing babies to be born with 6 toes kind of BS, which I never believed a word of, until one day. My little brother came running back to the barn, saying he'd seen a frog in the river, as big as one of the farm cats. Listen, I still didn't think for 1 second that he could be right. But it did get me thinking. I wandered down there a bit later, and whilst I didn't see anything particularly suspicious then, there did seem to be some issues that warranted further investigation, such as a large flattened area that looked like some sort of animal had made itself a nest there. But really, what is big enough and wanted to live in the dank conditions? Well, I had no idea. Farming life is busy work, and I soon forgot about going back down there. Cleanly went out of my mind, truth be told. That is, until we began losing sheep. Now, every farmer knows the odd attack on animals is not unheard of, and sometimes a fox, bobcat, cougar, or whatever will get onto your property and maul something for its dinner. We had 3 of our sheep go missing in as many days. No sign of any broken fencing, and the only real clue was a large puddle to where near they'd been snatched in a terrible smell, kind of like a swampy bog in the river. It had a very interesting, unique odor profile. It was extremely musky. If you've ever smelled a skunk, you'll know that a skunk is overly musty. Well, it was kind of like that, but its own unique musty odor profile. And the third was taken, and still presuming that this was the work of some kind of wild cat or dog, although with the smell, I had nothing to pinpoint it to. So, I decided to stay up that night and keep watch, staying far hidden out of sight, with my shotgun by my side, of course. Whatever nasty predator was messing with our livelihood wouldn't be making the same mistake again once I had attempted to blow a hole in it. Or, if I was lucky, blow its head clean off. I waited and waited, and sometime in the early hours, right before dawn, I had heard it. A loud, squelching, wet-sounding footsteps. For a moment, I couldn't fathom what I was seeing. And to this day, whenever I tell this story, it sounds like something from the Sci-Fi Channel. There, stepping over the fence with ease and heading right for one of my biggest snoozing sheep, was what I would describe to you as a lizard man. Yes, you heard me right. A lizard, as tall as a man, standing upright like a man, with 2 legs, 2 arms, a body, walking just like you or I. I literally use the term lizard man as accurately as I can. What I was looking at was undoubtedly half man, half lizard, at least in appearance. It hopped over to the sheep, its grayish, scaly body seeming to glow in the moonlight. Its face was kind of reminiscent of a gecko, eyes on the side, and a snout and a long forked tongue which shot out occasionally. It picked her up with ease and turned around, so I got a good view of its back, including its long sweeping tail that was more reminiscent of an alligator. At that point, I was so stunned. I suddenly had to give myself a mental shake, and I fired off the gun. 3 shots. This thing turned around and let out this horrible scream or roar. It was a really loud hiss, but it sounded distorted. It wasn't right. This thing looked right at me, and then ran, still carrying the sheep. Despite being utterly terrified, I ran after it, following it to the river. I shot off 5 more rounds, hearing each shot land somewhere in the water. I waited, but I never saw a body rise to the surface. In fact, I wasn't even 100% sure that I hit this thing. I consider myself a decent shot, but this, I'm not sure. Eventually, I went back to the farm, and the next day, I went back down there with some of the guys. We all had guns as we poked and prodded at the river. We fired off of our bullets, but we never found anything. I think I must have heard him that night though, as not once did we lose a sheep again. Even though that happened to me, I still feel really skeptical about the whole aliens thing. But who knows? Maybe what I saw was indeed an alien, which would explain all the lights and weird sounds that many people claim to see and hear around there. I'm not exactly sure, and I never would imagine an alien looking like a lizard man. Back in high school, we all had this gym teacher whom we hated. He was tall and thin, and looked down, literally and figuratively, on anybody who wasn't any good at sports. This included things as much as running and track, let alone football, and any other recreational sport. He was a real show-off, spent far more time in lessons demonstrating just how great he was, rather than actually letting us play. Prideful much, and in no lesson was this more the case than swimming. Whether he thought we should have been in the Olympics, or whether he imagined that his lean, muscular body was a turn-on for the senior girls, I don't know. But he always seemed to find a way to end up in the pool, showing us all how to execute the perfect dive, or whatever. I suppose that maybe some of the girls might have thought he was handsome. I'm not too sure. But aside from being a job's worth and a slave driver, he had these really intense eyes. I used to joke with my buddies in the locker room that the reason he was so strong and agile, and especially good in the water, was because he was a lizard. See, I wasn't good at sports, but I aced creative writing. Years spent devouring comic books gave me a very wicked imagination. I would just spend all this time making up these little stories about him, and of course they loved it, egged me on, laughter filling me. However, it was all in jest, right? A way of dealing with inadequacy and possibly a little bit of envy. And, the dude scared me. He loved handing out Saturday detentions like it was nothing, and I just scored a weekend job in the independent bookstore. No way I was going to mess that gig up. So, when I got called into his office after track one day, I just hoped and prayed to everything there is that none of my buddies had betrayed me. Turned out the course Someone had, and he was pretty pissed about it. I remember him barking at me, and I just remember falling into the chair. He told me that he heard that I like to make up stories, but I could just feel his eyes boring into the back of my head. I asked, not wanting to give myself up, if I had a sliver of chance making it without punishment. I mean, what could he possibly do? He slowly walked over to his desk, facing the wall behind him, and told me one of my boys, my friend Charles actually, said was a snitch, and told me all about my locker room games. He asked me if I thought it was funny, with a very stern and serious look, not even joking. I thought this was going to be the end. I would regret not graduating high school. But I just sat there, gripping my chair, in hopes for just a warning. I answered to him, "No, sir," and I began, when all of a sudden, he turned around in his chair, put his hands on the desk, and leaned over, so he was really close to me. I thought I was about to get the most intense chewing out of my life. You know, kind of like how when you screw up, and your dad pulls you in close and just lets you have it verbally. Well, that's what I thought was going to happen. The suddenness of the move took me by surprise by what happened next. I'd swear my life on it. His face was right in front of mine, close enough to feel his hot breath, and he stared very intently into my eyes. 1, 2, 5, 10 seconds. He just kept staring and never blinked. Then, he blinked really fast, and just for a split second, his pupils were slits and yellow, like bright sunshine yellow, like a lizard. Then he blinked again, and they were back to his usual green eyes. He smiled and had a huge grin that seemed to stretch openly across his face. I must have just been there, sitting there, mouth agape. He answered yes. I think that'll be all. He looked at me very sternly and told me I won't be making up any more stories, will I? I sat up straight and answered no, sir, and just about managed to shoot out of the door as quick as I could. I never really told anybody about what I saw, and I sure as hell stopped making up stories about him. I didn't know exactly what he was, but that moment is something I'll never forget. Well, I tried to jump on YouTube and Google and find out what I could, and that led me down the rabbit hole known as not only lizard people, but actually reptilians. Reptilians in disguise, and I think he might be one. And here I was, never thinking that lizard people were actually a thing, but turns out reptilians are a real thing. And I did not unmistakably see those slits in his eyes. Was he hiding it? Was he purposefully showing it to me? I don't know. I think it was some sort of intimidation tactic to keep his anonymity. I'm going to get this story out there as much as I can. From now, I believe that these things and people are real. When you're a kid, you do all sorts of dumb stuff, right? The power of truth or dare, and especially the terrifying must-do status of the double dare, was something that you lived by when you were a kid. At least we did. This was the early 90s, way before the internet and cell phones rotted our brains and took over our entire society like mindless drones you see today. We'd all heard the rumors, urban legends about people buying what they thought were turtles, and when they turned out to be baby gators, they flushed them down the toilet, right? Well, the thing is, a rumor has to start somewhere. On this particular day, it had been raining heavily all morning, and me and my two best buddies had been stuck indoors for hours. Finally, the heavy downpour dissipated enough that we were allowed to play outside. Donning our raincoats, I called out, "Dare you go look in the storm drain?" It must have been the overexcitement of being let out, after having been cooped up all morning, as I really hadn't thought it through. I realized this as soon as my buddies replied in unison, that they double dared you to. Crap. As a kid, you know, the double dare is holy. There is no backing out. You literally have to do it. So, I did. I walked over to the drains. I could see the water almost overflowing down there. Almost, but not quite. There was just enough of a gap to be able to peer down deep into the dark. Now, Pennywise may have been scaring kids and adults around the same time, but none of us had been allowed to watch it or even know what it was. So, I wasn't worried about clowns or balloons. No. We had heard there were rats as big as cats, and that sometimes you might see a giant turd floating past. That was the extent of our juvenile minds at this point. So when I bent down, my hand covering my mouth and nose, as there was a distinct sulfury stench emanating from below, the last thing I expected to ever see were two reptilian eyes staring at me. I just about peed my pants and fell backwards into a larger puddle on the road, soaking my pants and my butt. Of course, my buddies were close to wetting themselves too, with laughter, and not with fear like I was. That was, until those bright yellow eyes rose out of the sewer water, attached to what I can only assume was the head of an alligator or a crocodile. I don't really know the difference. What I do know is that this isn't Florida or the Amazon or something. This was a little suburb outside of New York. The only place I should have been seeing this guy was in a Central Park zoo. I screamed, not caring what my buddies thought. I screamed and screamed, and for whatever reason, this seemed to frighten or at least startle this creature, and before it could leap out of the drain in what I thought was going to devour me, it was gone. My friends came running over, asking what the matter was. Did I see a rat? Or a giant turd? It was... I stopped for a moment. I still wasn't sure exactly what I had seen. I told them it was a crocodile. And of course, they laughed at me. They laughed at me the rest of the entire day. They just told me good one, and kept slapping me on the back. But I insisted over and over that I saw something that didn't look right. I don't even know if it was a crocodile. It just looked like one. It didn't act like one. A crocodile wouldn't show that much interest in me, and I'd like to think so, and wouldn't stare at me with intelligence like this thing seemed to do. I don't know. I know there are rumors of alligators and crocodiles living in storm drains, but how much of that is actually truth? I don't know. In fact, I'm still not even sure if they believed me. I don't think I would, had it happened to my friend, and they told me. But I'm telling you, I know what I saw, and I think this is more than just seeing an alligator in a storm drain. This was something else entirely. I'm originally writing in from Ireland. I own a bed and breakfast here, and have done so for around 40 years. Our bed and breakfast has been in my family for multiple generations, and I do my work with the utmost pride. You can imagine, having it have been in my family for this long, I take great care when it comes to our business. I have hosted guests from all over the world, and enjoy hearing many different types of stories. I suppose it's been a quiet career in many respects, but it has had its moments. Well, I shouldn't continue ranting and raving. The reason I am sending this to you is to discuss a happening that occurred right around April of 1995. I remember it well, as it was around Easter time, and that time of year always attracts a horde of surfers. Granted, this was long before Ireland got Americanized, and surfing was a rare sport then. But my guest at the time, his name I'll keep anonymous, but we'll call him Martin, was a surfing instructor and stayed at my bed and breakfast for only a few nights, as he was training a group of young guns on the waves. Well, I made Martin a big Irish fish fry, and told him to have a great time on the waves. I remember him saying to me with a smile that why don't I come out and watch him. Of course, running the business, some days were kind of dead, and I had no real plans for that day, except doing a bit of washing, and so I told him that I think I would. It's best to try and stay young, I thought, so I have to try new things, and constantly be putting myself out there. I had no intention of going surfing, of course. I would just watch him, train his crew, and cheer them on. Plus, after working day in, day out, life started to become mundane, and so I need something, a little bit of excitement. I decided to even bring in a flash of tea down for them. Well, something happened out on the water. Something that troubles me to this very day. Something that took this bay away from me. It's a very romantic, sensational sight, and now it's filled with horror and defilement. Anyway, I was watching Martin and his students from the sand. They were doing great, and I loved watching them on their boards. Some were good, and some were not so good. It was after around an hour that Martin remained in the water himself, and his students went back to get changed. He was a very strapping man, and the water appeared to be his domain. It seemed he was very comfortable, and on a surfboard, he was gliding like it was nothing. You could tell he surfed with confidence and experience. My eyes enjoying the sight and savoring the moment of watching an expert teach somebody. Then my blood ran cold. Something came up from behind Martin in the water. From what I can make out, it was an odd, bizarre, and horrific-looking sight. It was a creature, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was no more than the size of a dog. It was a dark, scaly green color, from what I could see, and it appeared to have 6 legs or appendages, but I could not see its fins. The legs were like 3 on each side, supported by a long body. It had a very long tail that shot upwards and extended about 1 foot above its head. Its face, however, was the oddest thing. The only thing I can even compare it to is that it was fleshy, red, and kind of had a beak, like in a way that a squid would. It had a distinctive sagging of its skin. It looked bizarre. I shouted at Martin to get out of the water, all this while happening in just a matter of seconds. I was screaming as loudly as I could. He looked up and waved, but not noticing this thing behind him. The creature then shot out at Martin and seemed to dig its beak deep into his foot. He fell off his board, screaming, thrashing around the water. His foot too was tied on by a rope of a surfboard, so it looked quite heavy as he shook that off. Eventually, he grabbed his board and crashed it down into the water, as if trying to wrestle off this thing. I stood only meters away now, but frozen, eyes wide in complete terror, as I watched man versus beast unfold before my very eyes. I heard a large groan, and then I saw Martin running, limping, blood dripping down. I was so relieved he had gotten out safely. Whatever that thing was nicked him pretty good, and after getting some medical care, we ended the night with having tea and crumpets, and wondered what the hell he saw. The main thing that we could agree on was that he was safe and nobody was really seriously hurt. Naturally, Martin left, and I managed to get his wound dressed up, even more so later on that night. I never thought much about the incident afterwards, but this year during lockdown, I got a phone call from none other than Martin. He is in his mid-50s now, and he told me that he came across a database of mythical creatures, or so he told me, and he thinks he found the thing that attacked him all those years ago. I was shocked, and found the entire thing unbelievable. Thankfully, I have never heard of anybody else coming across a beast like this, but I thought it was good to write to you and let you know what happened about all those years ago. You know, sometimes I wonder if plastic pollution, or even chemical pollutants in the ocean, have caused certain marine creatures to deteriorate or even mutate into form. It is logical and a very plausible explanation. I don't believe in sea monsters, but I do believe in chemical mutations. Anyway, I hope that we can identify the creature. I still have his number, and we are both eager to find a resolution, since we both still talk about it, even all these years later. In fact, I figured by writing to you, I could get more answers as to what this potential mutant water reptile could possibly be. But even after doing my own research when I have time, I can't find anything on what the descriptions that I gave you match up with any animal or any living thing currently in the ocean, which can only make it a handful of options, either a mutant or something else. After scouring YouTube about who I can talk to, I came across you and a couple of others. So I wanted to write into you about a very odd experience that occurred in the winter of 2018. Now, it is crucial that I can remain confidential and anonymous, as I am a screen director on a celebrity challenge show. Our show has an international audience and attracts millions of viewers. Basically, we pay celebrities to come onto our show, spend a few weeks in a jungle, and partake in pranks, challenges, and particularly feasts, such as eating bugs, skydiving, etc. It has been a fun job and a pleasure to entertain millions of people. But last year, I quit after a very unfortunate incident which occurred the previous winter. We have safety engineers and skilled rescue workers on all of our challenges who ensure no harm come to anybody. Our insurance covers any unusual experiences, and we get all the celebrities to sign confidential contracts that explain the risks on the show. However, this particular incident was beyond any risk that I could have envisioned. I hope you can appreciate that I have to try and remain confidential as possible. Basically, one of the challenges involved a particular water task. It required the celebrity to climb down a narrow well and swim through a tunnel filled with water. Of course, the tunnel was secure, and we had done all the reasonable risk assessments. We had trained divers on standby, just in case anything went wrong. You kind of have to in these situations. You want to make sure your butt is covered. So, this individual went down the tunnel and had the goal of collecting stars throughout the tunnel, which was filled with water. They were fitted with an oxygen tank and got a pep talk. Well, she went down the tunnel, and this person, who I also have to make sure they are nameless, when she went down, she said she felt fine and could give thumbs up if she felt comfortable. The signal for trouble was 2 fingers raised, so of course all the crew were quite shocked when she immediately raised 3 fingers, went down. Initially, we assumed it was a joke, but she started flapping her arms like a darn banshee, and we sent one of our divers down. The next thing that happened was unbelievable. We watched it all from our monitors at our station booth. An odd-looking thing. I say thing because it was some sort of creature. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a fish. And it wasn't a person. Whatever this was rapidly fast and swam faster than anything I'd ever seen, and it sunk its teeth into the right arm of this girl. This thing was odd as hell looking. It looked very lizard-like in the face, was blue, had spiky thorns all along its back and head, and its face seemed to have red on it. The body was a mixture of orange and blue, but it almost seemed to blend into the water. As I pressed closer to the monitor, I saw the creature had a tail that was flexible and swayed sideways as it swam along. I screamed to get her out. I yelled to the divers, and I sent all 4 guys in to get her. This thing now released its grip and was tugging at the wires on her neck, which were directly linked to her oxygen supply. I exclaimed and wiped my brow and looked at this monstrosity again. This time, I remember I tried to study its face. the fact that it had expressions and features. It almost resembled that of a large reptile, like some sort of hybrid. The creature released its grip, showing fangs that were about the size of several inches long. It moved with a rapid motion, showing clear intent to wound, or even worse. The creature then locked its grip on one of the divers, this time in his lower abdomen. It looked horrendous. The diver was able to punch off as he thrashed around, banging his head against the tunnel wall. The creature then returned to the celebrity's neck. My face being drenched in sweat, I had the most terrible feeling that somebody was going to die. It continued to grip at the celebrity's neck, and I began seeing splashes of blood pouring out and bubbling. I thank God that this wasn't live on air. We were most definitely going to have a lawsuit, but I didn't know what the hell that thing was in the water. And finally, the divers managed to retrieve her and get this thing off of her. We watched it swim through the tunnels before it finally disappeared. It was by far the most bizarre experience, and most of the crew were watching. I have no explanation for how this even happened, or where it came from, or what this was. Naturally, the first aid crew arrived and gave her the needed medical attention. As it happens, we were also being sued by this same person. She believes we planted this thing there to attract ratings. Even though this segment was never aired, it has found its way onto the dark web. I'm not sure how that happened, but it makes me sick that some people would want to watch somebody else in distress. I have no desire to relive the incident, as even recounting it makes me feel worse, and I could feel the nerves and anxiety running throughout. I'm typing this up to you before I have to deal with this lawsuit, and if anybody has ever seen this creature before, or anything similar, I would like to know that I'm not the only one who's crazy. The show and company that I was a part of were also heavily crucified, morally and socially. In fact, we even had a sect of the police come out and deal with this investigation, as they called it. Many of our stuff was taken. Cameras, footage. Much of almost everything was taken. And in fact, this isn't the American police, by the way. This is a sect of police that I believe derived from the UN, or so I was told. But again, this was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Even though the show is set and based in Asia, I know that there are all sorts of wild and unusual creatures there, but not unlike anything I've ever seen before. I still feel dread and fear over the entire thing. Not just what could have happened, or seeing this unknown thing, but the fact that I'm now dealing with a sect of police that are from a global unit, and the potential wrath of any Asian governments that decide to step in. I hope if the lawsuit goes well, that perhaps I can return to having a career again, but we'll see what happens. I don't know if there's any such thing as a giant water reptile, but if there was, this fits the description quite well. I was on a major roll with a hike in the Arizona wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, and I found myself following a set of railroad tracks into the sort of places you don't really want to be caught alone in. You know well what I'm talking about. The desert itself is not a place you want to be, and Arizona proves to be a death zone if caught off guard. But I was too pumped, too flushed with endorphins, too ready to go and make the feeling last. I could see the red cliffs that had loomed over me all day, turning a rich pink in the setting sun. The clouds soon followed suit. I promised myself that I would be turning around and heading back to town at a reasonable hour, before wolves or coyotes or anything else would be afoot when I was heading back. The things you have to do to stay safe. The tracks led me right into a ghost town. No kidding. Some no-name one-horse settlement in the middle of nowhere, where the railway happened to pass through. You might find many places like this among Nevada and Arizona. Old homesteads, houses, even towns that were once a place of booming business and life, and now just a decrepit old shack. This place was so old that everything was thin and hollow, enough to be cardboard props for a Hollywood movie set, I guess. But it did have all the earmarks of authenticity. I tried to pull up my GPS just so I can get an idea of what this place is and what it might have been at one point in time, but I had no signal. And if you're trying to get your GPS going and you have no signal, well, you know how difficult that can be. I glanced around for even the slightest footprints, and there were none. Not that I really expected any to be preserved with the level of wind traffic, but, I was hoping I could have gotten lucky. There was something off about the place, other than the simple fact that it was uninhabited. The buildings were ordinary enough, looked like they belonged, but there was something else that I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I wasn't quite sure what it could have been. Small as it wasn't just a camp either. There were the remains of a post office, a very small saloon, several dwellings and businesses that I couldn't even associate without a profession. It was when the shadows were their longest before there weren't any light left to cast that I realized what seemed off about the place. The layout was the usual north, south, east, west that you usually saw. It was all laid out in a way suggesting that there was at one point something at the very center of town. It gave the entire place a very similar atmosphere. Stonehenge, maybe? No. Not that I'd ever been there before, but darkness was coming quickly. So I decided to scope out the center of town and find out what the literal center of the attention was all about. Maybe snap a few pictures and get out before the local wildlife would give me anything to worry about. I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be caught in a pack of coyotes, especially if they're hungry and they're looking for a meal. Or, God forbid, whatever else roams the desert at night. I've heard stories of skinwalkers, and while I don't believe them, I don't want to be caught by them, assuming they're true. I discovered that the focus of town was a wooden obelisk, eaten with time, just like the rest of everything in town, and yet it was also somehow more intact than everything else around it. It also seemed like it was the oldest thing. I was nearly scared half to death as a voice greeted me out of nowhere. It appeared to be a young woman, and she wanted to know if I was lost. I was going to remark at how I didn't think there was anybody else around here in this abandoned place, when I suddenly saw movement all around me. Mostly silhouettes and vague shapes among the husks of abandoned buildings and what was left. The most disturbing glimpses were from the young woman herself, though they were fleeting. I swear, I saw the shadow of a tail behind her, like a glitch in reality that lasted nearly a split second. I also saw her tongue flick for a brief moment, narrow and thin like the ribbon of a bookmark. And then, there were those eyes of hers. They were an eerie shade of green that seemed to glow. Each passing second brought a nameless tension that caused every hair on my body to stand on end. The source of it seemed to be divided between her and the wooden obelisk. My mind was screaming magic. I was experiencing some kind of curse or hex, and my most basic instincts knew it. I left without another word, even as the young woman was offering to find a place to put me up for the night. She could call someone to make arrangements to take me wherever I needed to go in the morning. I kept right on trucking until I was far out of there and out in the wilderness, following the tracks back home. It was already eerie enough that that place was a dilapidated mess of forgotten memories, but another that this girl, perfectly dressed and didn't look like she was some sort of ruffian, came out of nowhere, offering me a place to stay. I was out of immediate danger, or so I thought, but my story doesn't stop there. I try to tell people about the experience, and nearly every single one of them are dismissive. I couldn't even convince them about the location of this ghost town. My cousin even made a bet with me that if I could drive him to the town, he'd believe me. Sure, no problem. I found the railroad tracks. I picked out the landmarks I could remember, and there was no trace of this town. It was gone. I wondered if I was under some sort of spell of illusion so that I wouldn't see it, but I couldn't find the slightest indication of any dwelling in that wilderness. That was the closest I'd ever came to believing all that stuff that I've heard on those 4 a.m. talk shows, about demonic reptile people. To think, they could be living in the dark corners of the earth like that, right next to us, masking their dwellings with magic, or voodoo, or whatever. I have also considered the possibility that I have had some sort of heat stroke that day, but I find it really hard to believe that I hallucinated a fear that vivid. If supposed reptilians are real, and if the magic they practice is real, then the pecking order that places us in a very, very uncomfortable to ponder. I had the rare privilege of excavating a fossil from some sedimented rock with my uncle. He had been on the dig 14 days prior, and one discovery led to another. A number of finds were the first fully intact specimens ever recorded, and he could not contain his joy, and had to get me involved. He first made me swear to secrecy before he got me involved in the dig. I didn't have any problem with this, but I did wonder why I had to be so hush-hush about something that carried enough raw power that could rewrite everything we knew about the fossil record, and some of the things it told us about the history of the world. He understood my basic confusion, but he wouldn't lessen the terms of our agreement at all, nor would he explain anything. He told me that my confidence was more critical than anything else in my life, and that whatever he or his superiors told me to do, it was imperative that I obey. So, I agreed. The very first specimen I got to help unearth was exactly the sort of thing that I wasn't allowed to blab about. Well, oops. I'm blabbing to you. Not just because of what we found, but also because of how it was handled and the implications that it carries. I was expecting the emerging bones to be that of an early human, but the more of the anatomy that was revealed, the more it was clearly something else. But it wasn't unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was humanoid, but had a distinct reptilian cast to it. The skull was clearly lizard, very advanced and developed. You can imagine my outrage when the specimen was unearthed and disposed of on the spot with a chipper. My uncle literally put his hand over my mouth and raised a finger to his lips. His eyes darted to his superiors and back to me. It took me a second to connect the dots, but he was dropping me a massive hint. The people overlooking the dig were different. Their gait, their stare, the cadence in the way they spoke was stilted, as if they were imposters in their own skin, and doing a very bad job of impersonating themselves. I kept thinking I heard a suppressed hissing sound in their breathing. Whenever I had to talk to any of them, they never smiled. They looked through me, not at me. I felt more and more uncomfortable during the dig, as my brain just simmered on the implications. We had just found a fully intact specimen of a reptilian humanoid. Exactly the kind of internet nutjobs like to defend themselves with tinfoil hats and crystals. The value of that thing in terms of dollars and information would have been astronomical. And, just like that, it was destroyed. No questions asked. No harm, no foul. The people that destroyed it were acting like they had to pretend to be normal. They had that cold reptilian stare that's talked about all over those conspiracy theory groups. To this day, I wonder if I was helping the reptilians burn the evidence of their history on our world. I wondered why even my uncle was helping them. That was the beginning of the end of my friendship with him. Maybe he was along just because it was the only thing, or the only way, he would ever get to see any of these discoveries. If I had been anywhere else, I would have missed out and never known what was found. I mean, looking back, I guess I can't hold it against him if he was afraid of what would happen to him if he spoke out. I don't know. The whole thing is huge if my paranoia is right, and I hope it's the kind of story you can use. But to give you a better idea, I don't know the exact country, but somewhere in South America, there's an actual statue. I believe it's made out of gold or some prized material, but it's a statue of a reptilian humanoid creature. If I remember correctly, it's Peruvian or possibly in Brazil. I can't remember what exactly, but the statue depicts a raptor dinosaur looking like humanoid. It's very terrifying, and many scientists believe that old Brazilians used to follow a religion led by a reptilian alien. I don't know how true it is, but that doesn't explain the statue, and it's pretty creepy if you ask me. Now, bring that to modern day, and you pair that with my experience. There's definitely something going on. I spent some time in prison a while back, and they sent me to the one maximum security in Nevada that you hear about the least. In fact, most people probably don't even know it exists. I had gotten into a scuffle with another inmate over some gang beef, and the guard that broke things up took an immediate disliking to me. Well, I was riding high after having just broken the other jailbird in two, so I decided I was going to hang on to my big shot status, and I spat on the guard's shirt. He looked at my spittle, as if thinking deeply about it. Then he grabbed me and led me away. We were going down a dark hallway that seemed to get longer and darker. I noticed that we were headed someplace that felt isolated and as overcrowded as the place was. That was saying something. I tried to keep up my tough guy routine, and I joked about how I must be getting my own personal living space. I can remember the guard didn't even flinch, let alone bust a smile. I was taken into a room with masonry that was totally off. Like, this wasn't your traditional bricklaying. It was like somebody suddenly decided to build a room in the style of something found in the pyramids. All sorts of weird stuff was carved into the bricks, signs and symbols that I didn't understand, but the collective picture of the whole thing made me very uncomfortable. The guard took off his shirt, and that simple act seemed to make him transform before my eyes. He was now green and scaly, and his skin had a leathery glint. He removed his dark glasses, and there were the two coldest eyes I had ever gazed into. They had a light, an actual physical light to them. They were emitting a glow. And I kid you not, the pupils were slits. The man looked like a snake that decided to be a man. He started saying something in a language I didn't recognize, but that didn't keep me from becoming more visibly terrified. More terrified than I had ever been in my entire life. It was like he cast a spell of terror or fear on me. And being a prisoner and an inmate, you get into some pretty life-threatening, serious situations. So I knew terror. But this was totally something else. I was starting to lose my mind, thinking I must be in an episode of X-Files or The Twilight Zone. This must have been a spell of pain, because every slap and punch was electrified. I kept blacking out from the fear, and I'm not that easily fazed by physical violence, especially being in an environment like prison. My last few glimpses of the guard included the long, blunt claws, pointed and jutting from each finger curled into fists. After that, my eyes were swollen shut from blunt, forced trauma. That guard was never brought to any sort of justice, and nobody, literally nobody, would give my account of what happened any time of the day. If these snake men are running the prisons, What else are they running? What are they really up to? If they knew some sort of voodoo or witchcraft, what does that say about how they're keeping a thumb on the masses? One of them showed themselves to me and beat me to a pulp without a sliver of fear of retaliation or retribution. The unspoken truths hidden in that behavior go beyond personal injustice. And now that I'm out of that hellhole, it is my job to reveal their agenda and their true identities among us.